Okay, well, the discussions from the table here have covered a huge range of issues. I'm just going to very quickly sum up some of the key points that were raised before opening discussion to the floor. So Harry started off by providing some definitions of equity, and I'm not going to repeat his definitions, but I think it's important to repeat some of the points that he made. One of the things that he mentions was that there are three principles around equity that we need to think about. We need to think about equal life chances, equal concerns for people's needs, and meritocracy. So those are three different ways of thinking about equity. Are we wanting to see equal life chances? Are we wanting to see equal delivery based on need, or are we wanting to see meritocracy? He raised the issue that inequity and inequality are sticky. In other words, they take a very long time to address, and he gave the example from the UK, from the English poor laws, which took 60 years to embed institutionally and 200 years to deliver equity-based growth enhancement. So, I mean, I guess we're all hoping that change doesn't take that long starting from now looking forwards, but what we're not talking about is changing the world in 3 minutes or even 3 days or even 3 years. We're talking about a process of change that takes a very long time. He also reiterated the point that these forms of change are political, and there can be political interest groups that stand in the way of equitable change. A number of the other speakers have raised the issue that this isn't the only barrier in the way. There's also the doability of equitable change, and what people want to see, what taxpayers and voters want to see, is that equitable change can happen. They want to see some stories of success so that they can believe in that. And Tim raised the point that if you compare the situation in the UK with other countries and you show that the UK is actually less equal than some other countries in the OECD, that encourages people in the UK to think, well, actually, government can do something to reduce inequity. So Tim presented some of the work that he has done, and very interestingly reported on the opinions that people raised in focus groups in the UK. And one of the things that I felt while listening to him is that it had very strong resonance for me as a researcher who does focus group discussion-based work in developing countries, because a lot of the issues that he raised were the issues that economic and political elites raise when they're talking about poor people. One of the things that struck me is saying it louder doesn't help. So I'm guessing that because we're all here, we're all pretty much in favour of equity, otherwise we wouldn't be wasting our lunch hour, would we? So for us, we need to remember that saying it louder doesn't help. So just yelling it again and again doesn't help. We need to think of innovative ways of creating an entry point, creating a discussion about pro-poor policy change. Tim raised some very interesting ideas that were new to me, this idea of cognitive coping, that we tell each other stories, we tell ourselves stories to make sense of the universe. Well, we all know that's true, but I didn't know the label. So we persuade ourselves that rich people are rich because they deserve it, poor people are poor because they're slack, lazy, idle, whatever it is. So we have these narratives going on in our mind that explains the world to us in a way that makes it seem fair, because otherwise it's very uncomfortable for us. And he raised the point that actually the global financial crisis has created a moment of opportunity because it's shaken everyone up. It's shown us how grossly unfair, not just grossly unfair, but unstable the current situation is. And it's created a window of opportunity that we can step into. And although shouting louder doesn't help, we have an opportunity now to perhaps lever some political discourse and discussion about this, not just in the UK, but around development as well. But people are fatalistic about making a difference. And that is in the UK, but it's also around economic development and improving equity in the South. And Claire mentioned that people, when thinking about development, are actually quite pessimistic that southern governments can do good things. And I think that is partly the fault of us in the development industry, to sort of summarise what we all do here at ODI and other people do, is that we bang on about governance, we bang on about corruption, and we don't actually say enough about what southern governments do that's successful and effective. And there are lots of success stories that we could lay on the table and say, this is what country X has done. It's moved from this position to this position. Without this policy, the situation would be much worse. So without having those success stories presented, the picture can be quite bleak. So fatalism about inequality, that's something that we can and need to do something very positive about. The effects of inequality. People are moved by the effects. They may be sceptical about inequality per se. They may think that inequality is deserved, and I like that distinction between deserved and undeserved inequality. So some people will think that inequality is deserved, so people are receiving the returns on merit, they're receiving returns based on effort. But when showed stories about what inequality does, for example, to children, they're moved by that and think actually that this is not a good outcome for society. So there are some levers that we can pull to persuade people that inequality is something that should be addressed. But there's clearly something that we have to do about the way that people think differently about people at the top and bottom of society. And we have images in our mind about poor people that we need to think about ways of changing. And that's not just true about here in the UK, it's also true in the South. And the narratives around the undeserving poor in the countries that I work in are profound and incredibly insulting. If you talk to elite people about why poor people are poor, the justification that comes out is very, very strong. And I guess it goes back to this cognitive coping, that, you know, poor Mr. So-and-so wouldn't be living in village X in that situation of penury and despair if it wasn't for the fact he'd done something wrong. Because it can't. An alternative is that it's something to do with the society that's given me the privileges that I have. So people are explaining that to themselves. Claire talked about how global inequity is extraordinary, incredible and obscene, and that's from a wide range of different people, and suggested a global welfare state, although she hated the term, and talked about this going beyond the MDG agenda into a future in which we're not just trying to address averages, we're actually trying to improve the basic minimum for all people. And she suggested a number of different tax mechanisms that might be effective in raising the kinds of volumes of money to do this. Milo talked about why dealing with inequity has been shown to be really important, because inequity is one of the issues that created the initial conditions that made the global financial crisis possible. So increasing inequality, all of us in society have aspirations. We want to consume along with everyone else. You've got this machine of consumption craziness, so we borrow to fund our consumption. Borrowing goes up, regulation goes down, and we end up where we're at. So that's kind of one piece in the jigsaw of why inequality and inequity is a bad thing. It's obviously not the only one, because we've talked about the innate injustice of being at the bottom, and Claire has talked about one of the policy instruments that might be effective in addressing that. Now, I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. You can ask a question, you can make a comment, you can be as radical and polemic as you please. You can disagree with people. Please, when you raise your hand to ask a question, don't just pitch in and start talking. Wait for a microphone to come to you. Say your name and which organisation you come from. And I will take initially a few discussions, points or questions, and then throw them back to the table. So who would like to speak?
Yeah, David Fallows, just an independent. I just got a question for Tim. I was just wondering, do you think the financial crisis created a more positive image of poor people, and that people are losing their homes and their jobs through no fault of their own, for a crisis created by rich bankers in London, but people are losing their jobs and homes and now find themselves on benefits and unemployment benefits and home benefits due to that reason? I was just wondering if that's helping to create a more positive image of poor people in the media.
So we'll take a few questions before throwing it to the table. Any other questions or points?
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer from DFID's Poverty Response Team. Just the point that you were making about how we aren't good enough on telling positive stories about what southern governments do, that reminded me of a sort of generic point I feel about the whole discussion about North and South, is that we tend to focus on the OECD countries and the poor, low-income aid recipient countries, and as donors and aid agencies, we tend to work with the poorest countries. And maybe one of the things is that we're missing out the countries that have got a story to tell about reducing inequality and being successful in development without aid. So the Brazils, the Indonesias, the Indias, South Africas, for example. And maybe one of the issues is that we don't know enough about the success stories because we don't engage with them enough. And actually, we spend too much time talking to countries that depend on us.
Any other points at this point? Yes.
Hi, Kate. Oh, that's quite loud, isn't it? Kate from ActionAid as well. Thank you very much to all the speakers. And with Claire, I'm working on she's working on the kind of global response and redistribution, and I'm working more on the kind of national response, and she's doing something along the lines of a scorecard looking at different countries and their responses to inequality. And one of the issues that we're finding is, like Harry's saying, it's very sticky. So how do we measure inequalities? If we're looking at these countries and we're trying to see what the impact is of various policies, what are the different ways of measuring inequality, given that all of the indicators are quite sticky and that we can't see change for X number of decades? Any insights on that would be very valuable.
Okay, I'll throw the question back to Tim.
Okay, so thanks for your question, David. I'm not sure if the credit crunch itself did that, but obviously with the recession kicking off at the same time, I think there was an element of what you say. Evidence from previous recessions, certainly, is that people can become a bit more sympathetic to the unemployed precisely because they can see the structural causes of poverty a bit more and don't tend to individualise it in the same way. That is offset a bit sometimes because people's own finances are squeezed. They sometimes become a bit more hard-nosed. But certainly, I mean, you remember that polling stat I showed you where people just didn't really agree that people could face insurmountable barriers. Making people aware of the barriers that others face, including at times like this, I think can not only be effective at shifting attitudes, like maybe you see a bit in recessions, but it's obviously very, very important as well for a whole range of social groups. Kate, I don't have an answer to that point specifically, but you pick up on an issue that is just the most difficult part of practical politics, which is the pace of change compared with people's expectations to see the results of change. Actually, most political discussion in public is kind of rubbish. We're talking about social effects that were probably determined by actions 10, 20 years ago. We're trying to hold people in government now accountable for that. I don't know if there is a way of doing politics with the right timescales at a domestic level, let alone at a global level. But obviously we need to think a lot harder about that. And Paul, just my reflection on your point about success stories. I mean, I follow news a lot as a layperson, just because I'm interested in it all. I don't think I know enough success stories, and I've seen them enough. And it's partly a media penchant for crisis, and partly campaigners' penchant for the problem and the doleful. But I think that would probably be quite important. Probably be very, very important.
Okay, coming back to that point about success stories, I think that's right. It's partly because people wanting to campaign around development problematise it, and it's also that researchers, by their training, tend to critique. So even if there is a success story, they critique it and say, how could it be, it could have been so much better, what a disappointment. So it's partly the nature of the way that researchers are trained. But more and more people in development research are becoming aware of the need to present stories of success. and ODI has been recently funded to develop a set of success stories. And that's not going to be a set of PR stories for donor agencies or whatever, but it is actually unpicking what drives success. And I think given the point that's been made about success being so sticky, and success now often has been determined by policies and interventions that happened a decade ago or 2 decades ago, often it's a matter of unpicking that causal chain and looking at where a country is now and what can we find going back a decade, 2 decades, a century, that can look at a plausible causal chain of why they've ended up here rather than here. And we know some of that from some of the countries, for example, Korea, Thailand. Some of those stories have already been quite thoroughly unpicked. But there are some other stories that we're hoping to explore from different sectors and different parts of the world. And I know that a number of different researchers around the country are also working on similar things. So I think that's my response to those questions. Do you want to respond?
Just back, while we're on this sort of success stories, middle income countries issue, I mean, I think you're right. We need to talk about success more, and like ODI and many others, we are starting to in the sort of partly in the changing climate of opinion about aid and the whole sort of value of any endeavour to try and do anything internationally about poverty. We're all being slightly galvanised into action to prove that we do have some effect. I'm not sure I completely agree. I mean, I think rather in terms of what the countries that you listed are doing themselves, I think rather disappointingly for this discussion, those efforts in Brazil and India and South Africa and in China to reduce poverty, which have been successful to varying degrees, have gone hand in hand with increasing inequality within those countries. So I think if you're concerned with poverty and inequality, one has to think about what the lessons are from those success stories quite carefully and what one might want to do. I mean, Brazil, interestingly, has reduced income poverty within Brazil over the last few years through a sort of very targeted program of income redistribution, and that perhaps has some lessons in terms of how if increasing poverty goes hand in hand with increasing inequality to some extent, then how one might sort of look at other policies after the event to increase poverty even further, using some of the resources at the top as well as growing incomes at the bottom. But I think there is a real, I think when one looks at success stories, the divergence between reducing poverty and increasing inequality becomes quite acute, and you need, in terms of this discussion and the whole premise of sort of running those two concepts together, we need to think about that very hard. Responding to Kate's question as well about measuring inequality, I think we're at quite an interesting point on that. I mean, I think in development we have, by and large, at least in our sort of quantitative, large-scale, macro-level work, we've accepted income as a proxy for well-being. We've basically what we're measuring is basically the amount of money that people have. And we're saying that, essentially we're defining progress by increasing the amount of money that people have, either as income or as in the form of assets. I think within the OECD countries, certainly in the UK, the discussion around inequality in the UK, for example, there's a discussion around income inequality. There's also a discussion around health inequalities, for example, which is not around people's inequalities of income. It's about people's inequality in terms of the way they experience health and the way they experience health services and so on. So I think that rich countries have kind of, in terms of their domestic debates, are further down the road in sort of disentangling what kinds of inequalities we're talking about and not necessarily accepting income as a proxy for all the inequalities that might be relevant in terms of improving people's lives. There are all sorts of interesting international efforts to try and think through these things a bit harder. The OECD has a big project. President Sarkozy in France has launched a big commission in terms of trying to measure what is it that we're trying to improve, enumerate that a bit better. There's the academic work done on well-being, on Richard Layard's work on happiness. There are all kinds of ways in which the absolute primacy of income as the proxy for everything that we might be trying to do is being challenged internationally, but I think it's it's inevitably a slow process. And I think there's a trade-off between the more your indicator represents the reality of people's lives, the harder it is to measure, the less compelling it is as a kind of single story to make the case for action. So I think there's a trade-off between the perfection of your indicator and the usefulness of your indicator in terms of public policy. I'm not sure we're quite at the right place yet in development, but I think it's changing in interesting ways.
Thank you. Some more questions. So we'll take another round and then bring it back to the
I'm Peter Thompson. I'm a journalist. I have spent. I've been a politico all my life. I remain a politico, and I have created a business plan for the telling of the truth about what is going on in relation to global poverty by the simple expedient of using computers to put the available information together and enabling people who are operating for poor people to say what they have to say about what the development community says about them. Because the development community is still stuck in a model of policy making in which the polite fiction is that we're working out the best policy and governments intend to carry out this policy, and that this is a practical mode of ending poverty. There are other modes that are possible in a digital age, and one of them is that no matter which country you look at, the available research, the available literature, the available intellectual property is not useful to poor people. And a very quick way to, rather than the MDG for education for all, a very quick way to boost the life chances of poor people is to enable truth to be told where local power structures are the main reason why poor people are poor. There is a business plan. It generates revenues the size of the total budget of the UN system, and it does that by simply enabling organisations to communicate accurately and fully about the present state of the world. It's a not-for-profit exercise. I would be very interested in anybody who was interested in it.
Hello, my name is Sridhar. I work at UCL, and my background is I work as a philosopher, and I also have development program experience. I wanted to say thank you very much for this panel. It's been, for me, very fascinating. I enjoyed it both and found very much useful, and I hope that you continue to do more like this, where you bring theoretical philosophy and development programs together. One of the reasons that I think it's important is that, in my experience, most of the conversations tend to be about trying to figure out how to do something, how to make programs more effective. But the reasons as to why we should do it tend to be something that people don't talk about enough. And this question about trying to say the reason why we are interested in health programs or gender empowerment and all that stuff is this sort of fundamental values, and what does equity mean in that, I think it is an important one, and giving reasons is an important sort of conversation to have. I think about this issue in a particular way, and I wonder if it would be helpful for other people, which is that when we look at global inequality and look at the way that we address it, there tends to be three spheres of it. One is that there's a domestic arena where people are concerned with inequity domestically. There is, for many countries, the question about foreign assistance and trying to address inequality in other countries through foreign assistance. And the third arena is where now we have countries that simply act on the international stage, and the impact of their sort of actions on global inequality. So, for example, I think for the UK, the reasons that it supports certain corporations and the kinds of policies that it implements to help the success of those corporations and the impact of those corporations on inequality in other countries is different from the way that it addresses inequality in foreign assistance. And those two things might actually be opposed and sometimes get prioritized. So we need to be able to differentiate the reasons in which we support domestic organizations acting internationally and the equity impact versus addressing equity in a foreign assistance package and trying to address equity domestically. So, and I think the reasons that people do those things need to be clarified and understood, and we need to be able to provide an assessment of those reasons. Now, I have two areas that I'm very interested in, and I invite anybody else who's interested in working on this with me. The first one is that there was an agreement made both in the United States and in the UK in politics. This was sort of the New Labour Agreement, which was inequality is tolerable in relation to economic growth, which is that if you have good economic growth, we will have greater resources to address a great amount of social problems that we've been concerned for a long time. And part of that was that we will tolerate inequality because we need to have incentives for people to work hard and produce more and therefore create a bigger economy. But at the same time, we'll get more resources to support various kinds of social programs. This is the same story that is told in many developing countries today. And for example, in India as well, economic growth is the number one agenda because the idea is that you have revenues in order to be able to provide social programs. So in the future, we need to be able to say, is that a sufficient story, whether here in the UK or whether it's globally in any developing countries? And we as people concerned about equity need to reconcile that story and say, where will this money come from? And are we willing to say, there's only certain kinds of economic growth that we're going to tolerate in order to minimize or lower equity. And that's a reason or story that we still have to yet to develop, and I think it's very important. The second thing is that in working in the UK on addressing, I work specifically on the philosophy of health inequalities within and across countries, and I've been fascinated by the split between the concern for health inequalities in the UK, where it's a very central issue, that when people see that there's life expectancy differs so dramatically by location, or there's a social gradient in life expectancy is a central concern. But when the UK government deals with health programs in other countries, there's no concern for inequality distribution. It's just simply an average, or trying to say the prevalence levels of various kinds of diseases. And in trying to work with DFID on that, there's absolutely no feedback. They just don't want to talk about that because they're concerned with vertical programs and all this stuff. It's very easy to measure distribution of health. It's very easy to measure distribution of income. It's very easy to measure stuff. And so and you can follow it year on year or 5 years, whatever, but there's simply not an agenda or a concern or an interest in measuring distribution, because the goal is, say, improving GNP or prevalence levels or averages or achieving MDGs. So if anyone's interested in trying to figure out how we can get distribution into a foreign assistance agenda, I'd be very interested. And the first one is this question about reconciling economic growth versus equity and how we're going to, in the future, say, in economic development in developing countries, what is the tolerable acceptability of inequality versus growth for resources to address other social needs.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take one more comment or question and then bring that back to the panel. Any more? Yep.
My name's Ewan from the London School of Economics, and I'd just like to say thank you for a very informative talk. I really enjoyed all of them. I was actually going to ask something very similar, and maybe just to put a point on it. Do you think, and I suppose this is a question for everybody, perhaps particularly Harry, do you think that there is a trade-off between economic efficiency and equity or fairness? One of the things that JFK was famous for saying was a rising tide floats all boats. And a lot of people especially around where I work, with lots of nasty lawyers and economists, they will all say that the best thing that there's been for poverty reduction in the last, say, 10 or 15 years has been economic growth in China, and that has dwarfed any other comparable efforts to redistribute income through public institutions. So what do you think? Is there a trade-off between economic efficiency and equity?
Thank you for your stimulating questions. I think I'll pass straight to Harry to come back on that, and then we'll go through the panel and people can respond as they wish.
Ewan, yes, I think there is clearly trade-offs to be made. I think the important point is that it's a trade-off not between. Well, yes, it shouldn't be seen as something which is secondary. You can put in place redistribution or social protection if it doesn't affect efficiency or growth. I think it's important to see how public policy trades off between these two, but also how they can contribute to each other and how you can have vicious circles or virtuous cycles. And I think relating it to your point, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. I think it is that sometimes equity is seen as too political. It might be worrying about how it interacts with the Indian government if it starts talking about inequality and starts talking about maybe power relations or something. And I think that's currently seen as a bit too dangerous. Maybe it's a remnant of Washington consensus in development. I'm not sure. That's what I have to ask.
Lots of interesting questions. I mean, from the just coming to that economic question for starters, I think there probably are trade-offs, and I do not know enough about it. My guess would be that there are points in a country's development where one does want to prioritise growth, but there will be diminishing returns to that strategy. Secondly, you need not accept the trade-off, and you can have pro-growth policies and either mitigate the effects of that on inequality or do other things as well that make those countries more equal. So it's not by itself a conundrum we should face, and certainly it's very easy to come into it from a kind of old neoliberal narrative that there must necessarily one damages the other. That ain't the case. There's lots of comparative research across countries, particularly more developed countries, since the 70s and 80s, since large international data sets have become available on welfare and inequality, which actually show that there's very, very little, indeed that show there's no real negative impacts on long-term economic growth of generous welfare policies. So actually, for more developed countries, the evidence is questionable. And certainly for those developed countries anyway, when you look at Richard Wilkinson stuff, there's a graph, they've long passed a point where you would be wanting to prioritise economic growth over equity. Earlier on down that curve, I don't know, and I suspect there's some truth in that comment about China. My point will be, one doesn't have to accept the trade-off as an absolute one. One can do stuff about both of them. In terms of the point about getting distributional issues in, again, I don't know much about that in a development setting, but that is an issue that is common to policy in a variety of contexts. So take schools policy. Government has lots of targets for schools. What it found pretty quickly is schools were meeting them by helping slightly more able pupils get better and improving their averages that way. The answer to it was quite simple. Rather than having targets which were couched in terms of averages or floor targets, you needed gap targets or inequality targets or so. So the right kind of it could be a very simple issue about the design of policy targets or policy objectives, but it's certainly something we need to worry about. And I think there's an interesting issue as well in how you do that, whether you focus on individual distribution of individuals or take an area-based approach. Again, I don't know what's best in terms of development. Health inequalities, for example, many countries like the UK, when they're talking about narrowing health inequalities, they're trying to narrow gaps between disadvantaged areas and less disadvantaged areas. That can be good, but unless you worry about the distribution of individuals within them, you're not necessarily going to tackle the underlying inequality. So I think they're both really, really good points. I had another point, but it has escaped me, so I'll shut up.
Thanks, Tim. Well, I'm the programme leader for the Growth and Equity programme, so obviously I think that both of them are important, and the way that we work is to try to lock those issues together. So it's not to say it's either one or the other, but it's to say they're both absolutely vital. And not just that, we're saying that they both can happen simultaneously, and it's about the nature of growth, and it's about the pace and pattern of that growth. So what are you trying to achieve? What is your objective? If you talk to some economists, what their goal is they would couch it in a GDP per capita sense. So averages. What we're trying to do is look behind the averages and say, how can you achieve development? Now, development for us is holistic, and it's looking at both the social and the economic, and of course the political that links those together. A lot of work has been done around pro-poor growth, which is another way of talking about equitable or bottom-up growth. So a big study co-funded by the World Bank looked at operationalising pro-poor growth. A big study that looked at 14 countries and what their history of growth is and how to deconstruct that history and to try to explain it, to explain what happened in different periods of growth and what determined those different patterns in terms of inequality and outcome. The OECD has produced guidelines on pro-poor growth to support policy making that will build growth, but build growth in a way that enables poor people to participate in growth in a way that's beneficial to them. So a lot of work's been done in this area. We try to do it by thinking about risk and vulnerability, inclusive growth, and exclusion, exploitation and discrimination. So we're doing a whole raft of work in this area. And Milo, I'm sure, will talk in a moment about some of that work. So depending on how you approach growth, there may be a trade-off. But policies can be put in place to support growth that incorporates poor people in a way that's beneficial to them. And at the very least, you can have a tax and spend policy that redistributes the benefits of growth. So there are two ways of approaching it. Either the pace and pattern of growth is such that poor people are included in a way that's beneficial, or if you can't achieve that for whatever reason, you can at least ensure that you have progressive taxation and beneficial social spending. I'm going to stop at that point and pass on to Milo and then Claire. Milo.
I'm going to respond to your question about measuring progress in an equitable way, or yes, it is easy to measure progress in health in an equitable way, and there's some work that we're doing now on success stories, trying to identify countries that have seen progress in health, for example, where the progress has been shared across income quintiles or across districts with at the subnational level between males and females, urban, rural. And that's something that is funded by the Gates Foundation, and that's something that maybe we need to understand why DFID is not as receptive to it. As you were saying, you appreciated this panel because it goes into the why, maybe to look at the why behind DFID's reluctance to fund it.
So finally on to Claire.
Okay, clearly this issue about a trade-off between growth and inequality is one that no one can resist, so I'm going to pitch in as well. I think it just struck me listening to other responses to this that the way that people generally try to reconcile growth and equity is to focus on growth which increases incomes at the bottom of the income distribution. And that's, in a sense, the sort of less, that's the way that people have focused on trying to reconcile those two concepts. Clearly the nervousness, both politically and in terms of possibly reducing incentives and things, come when you try to tackle inequality directly by reducing incomes at the top. And that's the kind of other side of that, which is perhaps where the kind of question about the trade-off between efficiency and equality becomes most acute. I mean, my sense is that once you start talking about trade-offs, it's partly a kind of empirical question. One can go away and find out. One can look at different experiences of redistributive policies, of different levels of taxation, of different attempts to redistribute assets through land reform and so on, and look at, insofar as one can compare different countries, and it's a very difficult thing to do, what the experiences have been. And I think the experiences show that it is possible to get quite high growth rates with very different levels of equality. one compares, we talk about China as a country that's reduced poverty massively, but also increased inequality. Well, Vietnam has a very different experience of also reducing poverty very fast, but with much higher levels of equity in that process. So I think, I think there are very different experiences. Partly those experiences are based on all kinds of country specificities, and it's difficult. But I think part of the answer to that question is to move away from the sort of more ideological and just towards the empirical, and say, if this is a trade-off, well, let's look at that, what that is, and let's look at where our lines flow and where the crossover is, and kind of what seems to work. So I think that should be the sort of direction of travel and that debate, certainly. I just wanted to come back to this question about truth and sort of giving people information. I think it's incredibly important. Just if I'm allowed a quick commercial break for some of our programs, and one of the things that ActionAid does is a big focus on what we rather unattractively call economic literacy, and which is exactly about trying to give people the tools to to be able to go and look at, if they are in a village where there is an aid project, to start asking questions about where the money's come from, how it's been spent, who's got it. And that has had some quite, dramatic results. People, local officials have been sacked, and, all sorts of things have happened as a consequence of that. And I think, these projects are small, they're quite specific, but they do point the direction of some of, what can happen. And we do that sometimes with our own projects, kind of paint up some of the villages where we work. We actually paint the figure, the sort of numbers, in terms of money being spent and where it's going on the walls of the different, sort of local buildings, so that people can actually see in a very kind of clear way what's going on. And I think that's incredibly important.
Okay, I would like to wrap up today's meeting. I would like to just make a couple of points to conclude. One is that this interesting point about we all think we're in the middle. And I think one of the things that we as researchers need to do is to increase knowledge of the other. So make sure that people have really concrete knowledge about the lives, the lived experience of the other, so that it actually shatters this image that we have that we're all in the middle and that other people don't need redistribution because actually, my situation is pretty much in the middle and you can't tax me because it's not fair. So shatter that image that we're all in the middle by giving better information of the lived experience of the other, and that's within the UK and also people in the South. Increase knowledge of what works, so that you also shatter this kind of passive acceptance of the status quo, and you say actually things can change and they can change in a positive direction. That needs to be supported by stories of success in the UK and stories of success in the South. And I think we've actually got a lot to learn across this north-south divide, both in terms of how people conceptualise issues around equity, and also in terms of research methods, because if you talk to Tim about the research he's done, it's really quite interesting. And intriguingly, it's quite similar to some of the work that I've done in communities in both Kenya, Uganda and Zimbabwe. So similar methods are being used, and some quite similar results are coming out. So, sharing North and South. What comes through very clearly is redistribution is obviously necessary. You're not going to resolve these gross inequities without it. ActionAid is thinking through some of the mechanisms to increase the flow of funds that might support that. And what's clear is social protection in a broad package sense might be part of the response to that. But that needs to go hand in hand with a set of other measures, for example, to build human capital, including health, and to increase the assets that make equity and equity of opportunity real for real people out there in the world. So that's to kind of conclude those points. Please do pick up some of the publication materials on your way out. Be aware that the presentation that Harry gave was as a result of a working paper that's recently been published by ODI, so you might want to search for that to find out more. The opinion that he's written is on all of your seats, and there will be a blog that summarises some of the key debates based on this event today on the ODI web within about a week. So do have a look, and if you've got anything to contribute, please do. And thank you for coming. Thank you very much for the panel.